Hi there, everyone. This is Mondian Astral Oracles. Blessings to you in this sacred moment of time. I was writing a gentleman today, talking about his relationship to religion, and if you see this, I hope that it resonates and helps you with some of the questions that have been bothering you and that requires answers. And what we were talking about was partially religion and Jesus and Christ, and it seems like a lot of people had tried to convince him that all religion was somehow evil and systems of control. And I wanted to bring you this perspective because from my perspective at least, religion is a basic mode of human expression. So saying religion is evil is like saying cooking is evil or painting is evil or something. If it didn't exist, we would have to come up with it, because religion is basically just a way of making systems out of what is essentially unsystematic or essential. So it's a way of ritualizing and let us say codifying different types of deep spiritual experiences into something that can be translated and is available for participation with others. And essentially, all religions begin as countercultures. So whether it's Moses or the Buddha or Lao Tse or whoever, you will find that this actually begins as a sort of rebellious instinct that manages to touch people around the person who's bringing this through, and therefore it begins to stir a lot of action in the world, because these impulses are very, very powerful. And that also means that at some point it will crystallize into something that's perhaps not very helpful, because that's essentially the dialectics of nature, that we are somehow inspired, or that an impulse moves into the world, and then it sort of codifies itself, or becomes organized into different patterns, and from that place an element of forgetfulness arises, and that also means that it can become a vessel for different types of energies that don't feed that impulse of the human spirit, but that instead feeds perhaps the impulse of social control, or repression, or dogma, or all those things which we would generally think are perhaps not very preferred. But what we are doing here is, of course, also a type of counterculture movement, that we are imposing new narratives on what it means to be a human being. And at some point, these narratives will also grow stale, and then we will have to invent others. But this channeling will be on Arcturian Jesus, because partially I connect the Arcturians very much to religious activity. And the reason I do this, and I believe there's an old video about Arcturian Catholics that you can find on the playlist, where this video will also be a part. But what they have explained is that because they're very, very good at building these type of systems and healing chambers, and used to work with, when they were incarnate, a lot of these type of almost artistic healing creations and modalities, that are able to reconfigure the physical structure in order to partially align it with its own energy flow and the currents flowing through it, but also to of course align it with the universal spirit, which finds different expressions in all parts of the cosmos, but is essentially universal, and that's the spirit that I call Quanta, and that's the name I use when I channel them, the 12th dimensional high energy, or the Holy Ghost. But this is an energy that feeds into all vital impulses in all parts of existence, no matter where you are in this infinite space. And I would really like to get the Arcturians' story on their own messianic characters, because what they have informed us is also that at different points of the history of ascending species, there is a sort of awakening of consciousness by certain individuals. So let's try to get some clarifiers on that. And I would also like them to explain sort of how a lot of these awakening movements in our own human history relates to the dimensional ladder, and what I have been bringing forward with the 12th dimensional ladder, and you can find this in a lot of places, but it's a very, very interesting structure, and it seems to be the structure that they present in order to make the basic structure of the universe approachable. And we call it ascension. The reason we call it ascension is because the first 7 dimensions are layered in our physical bodies through the chakras, and they move upwards and onwards from the gross to the subtle. So in that sense, for a human being, it seems very natural that you're arising from this point connected to Earth and then up into the heavens. But essentially, if we're speaking more universally, it's actually more of a movement within that it is a movement upwards. That is to say that think of the cosmos structured as a mandala, and the higher you get in the dimensions, the closer you are essentially moving into the center until you reach the 13th dimension, or dimension 0, or God, or all that is, which lies at the absolute center, and which is the perfect, ineffable realization of being as in its totality, what is also sometimes expressed in Sanskrit as Wahe Guru. So that's that's pretty awesome. But without further ado, I'll bring you Umblam, and he'll explain this to us. So enjoy, guys. Thanks for being here. Yes, and hello, my dear human friends. I, Umblam of the Arcturian Council, as well as all my Arcturian brethren, we greet you, and we look forward to sharing this story and this message of hope and explanation, this great myth that arose in our culture based on a person, an individual who came through at a section in our history or our time space to be able to illuminate those beings who were yet to feel or see the light emerging from the divine source. And so for all ascended species, you grow into this movement. But we would like, as my friend here has asked us to first explain how some of these spiritual movements, we could almost say the spiritual rebellion that takes place perennially in your history, and that seems to enter into your history every time that the pot needs a stirring, or every time that things have grown stale and there needs to be a airing out and a gust of wind into those things you experience. When that happens, someone will emerge into your time space, and to you they may appear as individuals, but to us they represent a ray of light emerging from the all into something specific. And that is of course why you in your messianic theologies also arrive at these paradoxes of the universal spirit. So the idea that the Christ is actually one with the all that is of the God, and he is also one with the universal energy that embodies everything, or that the idea that the bodhisattvas exist beyond time, and then this being enters into time out of sheer compassion, simply to illuminate and bring people out of the circle of painful incarnation that exists. These are all perspectives, but relating to the dimensional ladder as you have been explained it, and we will not go into the details here because we are sensing that so many of you are already aware of this. But when we speak of the 5D know that this is a mode of apprehension. This is a place where your focus is centered. And this is essentially the quality of attention. So, attention is the quality that creates worlds. You can think of the 13th dimension or God or the all that is as sublime attention, focusing everything into existence, keeping it in place with its unyielding, unbroken ray of light of consciousness that holds you right there and creates your existence. As you move up the dimensional ladder, you become more and more focused, and that this is why spiritual prowess is often measured in exactly how much the individual who holds this prowess is able to focus into their reality and thus recreate it and thus affect it with their mind. So notice that what happened with this epiphany that came through in your history approximately 2000 years ago and was focused in the individual you know as Jesus or Yeshua ben Yosef, or you also call him the Christ or the Anointed One sometimes. These are expressions that you use to describe this individual because you don't really know what to do with it. But if you were to study the scriptures and if you were to relate it to the dimensional ladder, you would realize that dimensionally speaking, this being was a sixth dimensional being. So what he did when he walked this earth was essentially that he was able to recreate, reconfigure, restructure, and bring about changes in reality simply by focusing his mind. And so you find a miracle such as producing infinite amounts of food out of a limited amount of food, which he performs several times in your scriptures. You also find the turning of water into wine as a type of very neat party trick that actually focused one reality so greatly that it was able to yield into his vision of it. And it was the same ability he used to cure the sick and heal the lame. This idea that he held a vision of these people as the perfect, healthy individuals that they were. And as long as these individuals would then keep focusing themselves in this new and changed reality that he offered them, then they would be cured of that ailment that they were suffering from. And that is exactly why the words are also spoken that do not sin, because essentially once you have received this healing, then sin can be thought of as, and we know this is a strange anachronistic term to many people, but it can be thought of the evil deeds that pull you into the misery of the world. And so notice, for instance, the great confusion that lies in the carrying out of sin. It is essentially following an impulse without caring for its consequences, because if you were to realize its consequences, then you would not do it. But what he essentially was bringing you into was this sixth dimensional being, was the fourth dimension. So you became very aware of the processes in time. And so this religion also came with an intensification of that historical notion which had already been developed in the preceding spiritual tradition from which he emerged. That is the tradition of Judaism, and more particularly Second Temple Judaism and the Essenes and the mystical traditions that were also connected to this. But these were people who were becoming acutely aware of their position in time. And as they became acutely aware of the position in time, they began to realize that they were part of this great overflowing superstructure of spirit that was flowing through them. And so what happened with the resurrection was essentially that this being then ascended from the sixth dimension into the seventh dimension, because seventh dimensional existence is exactly to be able to become present as a light being in whatever time frame you choose, to be able to appear in any type of focused conscious space. And so from that space, he was not only recreating the world where he went with his focused attention, but he began stepping into it at his preference. And notice again that after the resurrection, this being comes forward in a different type of body. This being comes forward, sometimes choosing to be recognized, sometimes choosing not to be recognized. This being comes forward as something that is not necessarily personal, but shows himself to Saint Paul on the road to Damascus, in order to also bring about his alignment. Because what then happened to the disciples from this movement or consciousness of time, they then moved into the place that you are moving into now, which is the fifth dimension, essentially. They moved into this space preemptively, and noticed then the great resistance that this time space, the density that they came into, held against them. And that is why it became in many ways also preferred to choose the death of the martyr, to choose this sacrifice, because that was essentially focusing the divine spirit, the Holy Ghost, the light of the divine energetic consciousness, unbroken universal consciousness, which you are moving into. It was focusing this into that act of sacrifice, thereby demonstrating what was happening. So you could say that there's a type of spiral effect in the dimensions where a higher dimensional consciousness will reach down into a lower dimensional consciousness and then begin to stir and awaken it, slowly bringing it into a space where it begins to resonate with higher dimensional energies. And so from the 3D of the Roman Empire, you have spent 2000 years exploring the 4D, becoming more and more aware of the historical process of the development of the nimble qualities of the mind, which is essentially a time machine, which is essentially something that moves beyond the realms and constraints of time-space and is not focused in those immediate desires of the 3D, but instead have, let us say, higher, more mental priorities. And then as you also began to puncture this realization by the realization of mental energies into the material, you manifested that phenomenon you know as the nuclear bomb. And the nuclear bomb essentially showed you that the process of time, the end result of time, was to destroy itself. And that was a very dangerous pivotal point you were at, and therefore so many entities, so many species, so many benevolent energies became invested in developing your process from moving from this 4D to this 5-dimensional step. It was very important for you to do so, because now you are as a collective moving into the 5D, just as you will be at a point at a collective, as a collective moving into the higher dimensions, and know what is happening now and recognize what is happening now is that these messages are not necessarily coming through one bright shining individual. You don't necessarily have to attach this to a fetishized idea of a perfect being, but instead you are able to resonate with the perfect energies that come through different imperfect vessels. Thereby all humanity is joining hands as you try to jump into this dimensional ladder. And you may sense there is a lot of resistance, but this resistance is natural and it is being resolved. And for those who are unable to resolve it, they will begin to drop off your timelines or your shared reality as it moves and progresses further into time. And so this exact same process happened with us, though of course in a different frame of time, space, and different energies, but seeing that we are also an ascending species, and seeing that these energies are universal, even though they manifest themselves very different in different planetary systems with different gravitational pulls and starlight. it is still the same basic dimensional energies. And so we also had this experience of, let us call them martyrs, beings who came into our space when we were still struggling with sorting out the game of difference and the great confusion that arose from us being a species that were moving into self-consciousness but were unaware of the direction of this movement. We called this individual Nok. That is in my language as I spoke it in my time, though there are many different ways to approach this being. What he did was also that he chose to came forward born out of the energy of two females. That is to say, he was in and of himself a masculine energy that encompassed two juxtaposed feminine energies in his being. You have this notion mathematically also, where in a sense two negatives make a positive, or in a sense two positives can join themselves together into an irrational expression. These are some of the messages I am bringing through the mind of this individual. Though notice what is important to latch onto in this story is that this individual then encompassed the opposition of these energies. Know that we Arcturians not only divide ourselves in male and female, but we also divide ourselves in different types of females and different types of males. Well, essentially, so do human beings, and that's why you have a phenomenon such as homosexuality, which is, as you are finding, is quite pervasive through nature, though you haven't really been able to figure out that what is the rationale behind this from the evolutionary or biological model that you're using to discern these things with. And the idea of this is essentially that some feminine energies are more tied to reproduction, and some feminine energies are more tied to fluctuation or the easing of flow, or the cultivation of compassionate energies between individuals, where some males are more oriented towards the active expression and some males are very oriented towards the transcendence of the emergence into the abstract. And so he incorporated these feminine energies in the story that gave birth to him, but he also expressed these masculine energies in his doings on our planet. And so he would essentially do the same as your figures have done. That is, he was a type of revelatory mendicant preacher, a person who walked around touching people with his energy. And he had this same ability to create these energy fields around people. Know that we are, if we were to translate it into human senses, you would consider us very auditory creatures. So the Arcturian physical frame is essentially also composed of a huge skull which resonates with where the entire cerebrum of our body, and indeed the nerve cells within our bodies, they resonate with a certain auditory spectrum that's then picked up by the entire organism and translated into a holistic vision of what it is to be an individual having an experience, much as your visual senses also perform this primary function, but is of course, as with us, complemented by other senses that play a more minor role in your experience. And of course, this also seemed to upset a lot of the energies or a lot of the unconsciousness that had been running in our collective. And what happened was, since we weren't too happy at this point already with hurting other individuals, but this individual was banished to a wilderness, But within this wilderness, he began to build gardens of sustainability. He began to build these small paradises of energetic integration where you could move out to, and where it would be possible for people to actually emerge into this. And so this gave way to the first experiments with what you know as the healing chambers, but what is essentially energetic zones, local zones of reconfiguration that is structured with intent. Seen from this perspective, know then that the monastic traditions that were founded by these messianic leaders that you had, well, these are essentially the same attempt to create higher vibrational spaces within energies and societies that are unable to accommodate them. And that is why all transcendent visions in your species have usually had the result of trying to create these spaces. You find it in your architecture where it is very obvious, but you would know if you had ever spent time in these types of sacred communities when they actually operate the way that they're supposed to, that there's a very, very great deep of concern, love, affection, and adherence to what is bright and benevolent and what is being grown within the individual or the acolyte that comes to these, let us just call them monasteries, because those are essentially what they are. And there is